He don't talk right anyway. Hello, I'm Randy Horton. This is the Don't Talk Right podcast. Today I'm talking to Lakshmi Hariprasad, and she is a singer-songwriter in Manchester area and performs at open mics and is just growing as a performer from when I first saw her. So welcome, Lakshmi.
Thank you, Randy. Really, really excited to be on this podcast.
Okay, why don't we just jump right into it and tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into music, how you got into songwriting?
Um, Musically, I have quite a musical background. My father was a classical musician in India, so it was his father before him. And so I've always grown up around music, Indian classical specifically. And I guess it really all started when I was about 12 years old and I started listening to the Beatles. A friend had given me the Red Album, and I was just obsessed. I couldn't. I just heard the sounds coming out from this little record player, and I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was almost like an out of body experience in a way. And that started my obsession with sort of guitar playing and wanting to be a guitarist and wanting to be able to do it. I actually wrote my first song when I was 16. I don't have it anymore. I don't know where it went. I wasn't a particularly good guitarist at that point. Not saying I am now, but I didn't have anyone to teach me back then. So it sort of faded from there. But I did write poetry growing up, and I've always been interested in storytelling. And I love that sort of aspect of music, the ability to tell a story and tell somebody's tale. Um, and it sort of languished for a very long time until, gosh, last year. So probably about almost exactly 12 months ago.
Well, the one thing I noticed, so I was fairly young when the Beatles were big. And so I think you were not born anywhere near that. So by the time you got into the Beatles, they had long broken up and John Lennon was gone, and so that I guess that speaks to the power of that band. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Especially growing up with going through the transition of listening to their early records and early music and songwriting, and how it was quite poppy and obviously appealing to 13, 14-year-olds coming of age, that sort of thing. And then going through that process as an adult and really enjoying and appreciating what they produce much later
mm.
has been quite interesting to have it sort of condensed in that way, even though I wasn't obviously around for their heyday as a band.
Yeah, I guess it's fun to see how younger people, because some of us experienced it chronologically, but for somebody to go back and look at it, it's okay, this is what they did first and how it developed. I don't want to spend the whole time on the Beatles though. What kind of poetry were you reading poetry then? You said you were writing some poetry then.
I was actually living in India at the time, and this sort of poetry evenings, open mics didn't exist then. I mean, it was fairly limited even in this country, I'm sure. This was mid 90s as well. So, as a young girl growing up, spending her teenage years in India, it was a bit more restrictive. You didn't have the opportunity to go out and explore the world. Um, it was quite dark poetry, to be fair. I've had, uh, you know, battles with mental health over the years, and at that time, I was finding my feet on trying to understand where my mind was taking me, and I was just putting it down on paper. Unfortunately, I think all of those poems are probably long gone, through transitions, through moving back and forth from the UK to India and back again and across the UK. But very much it was a way of trying to understand what my mind was doing and who I am as a person through those transitions of anxiety, depression, coming out of the other side of it, going back into it, coming out again.
Were there
That was kind of focus.
were there any particular authors who helped you through that, or was it more just a personal journey?
The writing for me was more of a personal journey, definitely. I think in terms of what I'm an avid reader as well. So in terms of what I was actually reading at that age, I was reading a lot of Agatha Christie and sort of classics. Later on, I discovered fantasy
Mm,
novels. Lord of the Rings being a classic, but
yeah.
especially in more recent years, I've been devouring women of color authors,
Mm,
Tasha Suri, Andrea Stewart, Chakraborty, all these amazing, talented writers, and the way they used the language was so completely different to anything I'd encountered before, and so evocative. It made you believe in a world that doesn't even exist.
right.
And it was just so powerful for me. And I think that's what influences a lot of my songwriting now. Is one of the first songs I wrote, you can see that kind of fantasy writing element in it. That sort of almost like, battle weary person going through the world. um, and I think that's been a huge influence to my songwriting. I should probably also add that something we haven't actually discussed before, Andy, but I did complete the first draft of a novel quite a few years ago, a fantasy novel. Time and life got in the way before I could finish the second draft. But it's something I'm thinking of going back to.
Yep. So long as you still have those words, you can always go back to it and hopefully get it out. Um, I'd love to hear some of it or see some of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, you talked about it a little bit already, but how is it different writing poetry or writing a song for you?
It's a very good question. I think I was quite intimidated by songwriting for a very long time because I didn't necessarily see myself as a composer. And growing up in a very classical household, there's this sort of sense that if you're writing music, you have to be a composer. Like you have to understand music theory and you have to understand music structure and formation and all of these things. And I didn't have any of that. I didn't learn any of that, weirdly enough. So for a very long time, I was quite intimidated by it. With poetry, I wouldn't necessarily follow a structure. It was more free flowing for me, and trying to fit that around writing a song was difficult. I moved up from London 4 years ago, and before I moved, I actually came up to Manchester. I just kind of absorbed the city for a few days and thought, okay, this is the place I want to live. And I remember sitting in a pub near Exchange Square and just writing poetry. I've still got that book somewhere, actually. That's reminded me. Um, because at the time I was working with a guitarist and I thought I could take it to him and see if he could put music to it. But it wasn't coming together. I think it was a poem. It felt like a poem. It read like a poem. And then I sort of took myself away from that a bit. And a lot of it has been influenced and inspired by going to open mics and seeing people who are perhaps hobby musicians, but very, very accomplished musicians, starting out and starting to write and having the courage to kind of stand up and say, this is something I've created. And I listened to these people and I was just in awe. And then when I thought about it later, I thought, actually, it doesn't need to be complicated. I don't need to add in wacky chords or do anything interesting. It can just be this thing that I write. And once I understood and got comfortable with what chords sound good together, then the words came quite easily from there for me. And for me, again, with poetry, I think poetry tells a story. I think with some songs, you can be a bit more inventive, it can be a bit more loose fitting. It doesn't have to tell a story, but poetry generally does. It needs to have a thread through it. And when I'm writing songs, I very much feel I need to be telling a story. And there's that link back to the poetry and the composition writing I was doing years ago.
It sounds like you've changed your approach, though. It sounds like you started writing poems and then trying to see if you could make a song out of it. But now you've gone to getting some chords and maybe a melody or a rhythm at least, and then letting the words flow out of that. So you've kind of switched the order you're doing it in, is that?
Yeah, yeah. And that surprised me because I've always been a bit of a wordsmith. And I believed that that would have to be the starting point for me. Whereas it actually turns out that, how do I put this? So I guess chords, music makes you feel certain things.
Right.
A minor chord, sad, is obviously sad or slightly down, and then you've got your major chord, and just a bit happier and livelier. And I think I find myself sort of, shower thoughts or 4 a.m. thoughts when you're lying awake. I just have these riffs going over and over in my head. I think I'd also boxed myself into this place where I thought if someone else has done something similar, then I can't do that. Like that's completely off the table. But when you listen to most popular artists or any artist really, there's influences and similarities there. And once I sort of stopped trying to be different and just be me, it became easier to try and tell my story through song.
Right. I've noticed, we have our little trio, we play music, and the simplest songs are frequently the ones that the audience enjoys the most, if they're musically simple. Something like The Twist, which is just E and A over and over again, but people love it. So yeah, I definitely agree that the very simple songs, they're boring for the very accomplished musicians to play, I understand, but audiences really do like them. I mean, those early Beatles, I think, are their most popular songs, probably more than the late stuff when they became more accomplished as composers themselves.
Yeah, and there's a reason for that. Apologies. There's a reason for that. I think it's easy, and this is obviously a generalization, but I think it's easy for especially classical musicians to think you have to change the world with your music. And it's easy to fall into that trap that you have to do something different. You have to be changing the rules constantly. But for me, I kind of find that there's no point in doing something wild and wacky and different if you can't share it with people.
Right. Yeah, I guess there's always that issue about do you want to speak to people or other musicians?
Mm.
I mean, it's the same with poetry. I mean, there was when I studied literature, I was a literature major in university, and we definitely were given ideas of good what made good poetry versus bad poetry. And at the time, this was 1980s, Rod McEwen was probably the best paid poet in the world, probably the wealthiest poet in the world, also the most hated by snobs, English professors and stuff. And so we would read his poetry as an example of what to avoid, because it was so horrible. And one student actually had the courage of saying, at least I know what he's trying to say, and she kind of stood up for him. Which was shocking. She didn't get any support from anyone in the room, but she stood up for that. He has these very simple rhymes and simple themes that everyone relates to. And it was right in that sense. If being great is speaking to people, he certainly achieved it. So given that, and you've kind of addressed it. What does make, if you're evaluating a poem or a song, what do you think makes one a great song or a great poem?
Oh, you're putting me in the position of a lecturer evaluate. I love it. If it makes me feel something, I guess it fundamentally, if I want to know more, if it takes me with it, and that's true for any writing, in novels, poetry, songwriting. If I feel a connection to it, and in fairness, it doesn't have to have the most crazy lyrics in the world. Um, I mean, the 80s taught us that you can sing the same word over and over again for, for quite a few minutes, and it's still great fun. Um, I think that's one thing. But I suppose for me as well, it's some of it will be a shared experience. If there's a memory connected with it, if I hear a song in a place with people that I care about and we're having a great time, that can also be a major part of what makes a piece of writing really powerful. Obviously, that's sort of almost disconnected from the writing itself because that's quite situational. Um, but yeah, it has to make me feel something. It has to make me want more of it.
Mhm. I I have this conversation with various people. You mentioned this storytelling songs, and I love those some of my favorite songwriters, the ones who tell these great stories, like Richard Thompson, um, people like that, Robert O'Keefe. They just tell these great stories. And then some of my other favorite songs. There was a band in the '80s, a punk kind of post-punk band. Well, post-punk means something different in America than it means in Britain. But there was a band called Flipper that had a song called Sex Bomb. It's about 8 or 9 minutes long, and it basically just says, "Sex bomb, my baby, yeah, my baby's a sex bomb," yeah, for the whole time. So not much effort in the lyrics, but it just has this great riff that just goes on and on and on. And so I'm kind of torn sometimes, like, well, because I very much appreciate those stories, and then I appreciate something that just kind of gets you moving and just lose yourself in. Um, but it does seem like you want to convey more than just a beat or something. You have something you want to say. The words are meaningful to you.
Yeah, definitely. I think form of therapy, I guess. It's a nice way to get all that the feelings and the stories I've got to tell out there. Sometimes the stories aren't wholly mine. Um, I've I've actually got one that I'm tweaking at the minute that was actually inspired by my boyfriend's 4-year-old niece, something she said, and I thought, oh, I can use that. Um, but um, but yeah, I think for me, in order to write, I think I find it easier if I've got a story to tell. Um, it makes me kind of make it's a weird process, I guess, because I quite enjoy seeing where the story takes me, if that makes sense. I'm almost less an author in control of the narrative and more sort of going along for the ride and seeing where I end up. Um,
Other than the Beatles, who are some of the songwriters that kind of inspire you, or that you would think would be great songwriters?
I do love Green Day. I think they're amazing. Uh, they've got that ability to tell that story and also have a fantastic riff
Mhm.
alongside it all. And I was lucky enough to see them earlier this year, and they're great sort of entertainers. They're really really amazing at it. And more recently, had quite a sheltered upbringing, so I didn't listen to a lot of music growing up. Weirdly enough, um, people like Chris Stapleton and being introduced to country music in a really meaningful way and watching all these amazing artists hone their craft and share that with the world is amazing. And as I mentioned earlier, actually, just watching amateur singer-songwriters on the open mic night circuit, just watching them and seeing what they do. It's given me the confidence to do my own thing, but it also inspires me to try maybe something a little bit different. Oh, Dolly Parton, I think she's incredible. Um, she's got some incredible storytelling ability and genuine gift for music. Um, but yeah, I take as much inspiration from the other very experienced musicians on the open mic night circuit as much as from well-known artists.
Yeah, it's the great thing about the open mics is they're so intimate, and you do really feel like you're coming into the world of those songwriters. I mean, if you go into even just a larger club, you feel like you're kind of on the surface of it, but when you're sitting in a really small pub and chatting with those people before they get up and do their set, it's very different, isn't it?
It is, and I think that's one of the things I absolutely love about the music culture in Stockport and Greater Manchester. It's so welcoming, and it's like you say, it's really intimate. And actually, as a person that loves going to watch open mic nights and loves going to watch live music, as as an audience member, I prefer that environment as well, because you're right there, you're right in front of these amazing musicians doing incredible things. Um, and it it's just lovely to see that nurturing aspect to the music um, here that's being produced. This is what encourages people to step out of their comfort zone and try something new. Doesn't always work, that's fine, but it's such a great space.
Yeah, that was what when I started that open mic that I do, I wanted a space where it didn't matter if somebody got up and didn't do, if they fell apart or got nervous, that everyone was going to support them, that they would know that everyone would support them either way, no matter how it went. That's what I wanted. I think it's going that way, and most open mics are that way, I mean, to be fair. But
Yeah, very much so. I I was when I was living in London, I did sing. I used to sing at open mic nights in London. I used to sing musical theatre, which will probably come as no surprise because you can't get much more storytelling than a musical theatre song. And I did find a couple that were, quite welcoming. But I've also been at ones where they very clearly don't like newcomers. So having seen that and felt unwelcome, coming here and being so welcome, and being allowed to fail and then get back up and try again it, that's how people learn, and that's how you make great art of whatever stripe. Is you're not always going to succeed, but you have to be allowed to fail to be able to get to that next stage.
right, you'll it doesn't mean failure is never permanent, is it?
No.
It seems like Manchester has a history really with bands who kind of went out and experimented, and and many of them made it. I mean, it's a great town for music and music history. It's good.
It is. I think it's pretty much what drew me to Manchester as a whole. I sort of arrived and thought, oh gosh, I've come home. I was always meant to be here.
Yeah.
And that was before I started playing and writing. So now even more so. It's really become a great place for me to just see where this music takes me.
Excellent. Well, speaking of where it's going to take you, do you have plans? I mean, what's the next step?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I think just keep chipping away, just keep trying different things. I'd like to be able to record perhaps an EP one day. I should probably get these songs recorded, to be honest. Um, Even though funnily enough, I don't like listening to myself. I'll let other people take the burden of listening to me. Um, but yeah, it would be nice to get to a stage where I could have maybe an EP of some stripe and do more open mics and keep being inspired by the amazing talent that's out there.
Oh yeah, well, I definitely look forward to seeing you at more open mics, and then I'm sure at your own gigs. Do you think you want a band around you, or you more happy just singing your songs? And
It's part of me would love to sort of work with a band. I think I tend to go not rogue, but in the sense because I've done theatre before and I've sung in choirs. For me, if my instinct when I mess something up is to muddle through, but sort of improvise a little bit. So I think perhaps I'd frustrate a band if I ever tried to work with one. Um, I think for now I'm quite happy to do my own thing, and it's funny you mentioned sort of solo gigs and things, and that is something I'd like to work my way up. I did a solo gig as a musical theatre singer a few years ago over in Salford, which went down very well. And if I can do that as a musician, that would be amazing.
do you ever do so see, I have this whole other thing. I mean, I started off with poetry and poetry open mics, and now you mentioned that you write poetry. So I'm wondering if you ever perform poetry now, or are you only doing songs?
Oh, it's a really good question because for some reason I didn't even consider it. I wouldn't rule it out. Absolutely not. I'll just need to maybe think about actually writing poetry, which it I mean, I do find it instinctively quite straightforward. But I've never written poetry to read or perform. So, but yeah, watch the space. You never know.
There is a big difference with page poetry and performance poetry for sure.
Very much.
So, any other anything else you'd like to say?
Oh, let's put me on the spot. Yeah, just watch this space. I've got 4 songs. I've written 3 that I feel quite comfortable with. I have a musician friend, and fortunately, she's based in London, so we can't collaborate very often. But I've spoken to her about maybe adding to the existing songs I've got. Um, there's a 4th song that I'm working on, and I will get those recorded soon, hopefully. At least a general recording, nothing fancy, and hopefully publish those on my page coming up. Still working on that, but we'll get there.
Yes, and your page is Lakshmi Music on Facebook.
That's right. Yes.
I'll have a link to that with this video when it's posted. So, well, best of luck with everything. Best wishes. I look forward to hearing new songs from you and seeing new performances from you. I know you're going to be going places, great
Thank
places.
you so much.
Thank
Thank you so much, Randy. It's been an absolute pleasure.
you. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.